In this video, we engage a large group of documents, the Catholic letters. I'm going to present what I think are the 5 most important things for you to know about this group. And before we begin, I want to let you know that I include Hebrews within this group. Historically, Hebrews has been associated with the Pauline letters, and there are good reasons for that. But this letter, Hebrews, is expressly not written by Paul. It has many similarities with the Catholic letters, though it's not a perfect fit there either. I group Hebrews with the Catholic letters, even though that's not what everybody does. So let's jump in, starting with number 5 and working our way down to number 1. Number 5. Half of the Catholic letters are not letters. Letters are recognizable by a number of features they have: a salutation, a thanksgiving, a body, and a conclusion with greetings and well wishes. We've seen these many times before at this point. Some of these features come down to us even today, albeit in a somewhat morphed form. There are no rules for determining whether a given discourse is or is not part of a given genre. Genres are both fixed and flexible. There are distinguishing constellations of characteristics that make a genre, but these are ever-changing. They stretch, form, and reform over time based on the discourses that fall within them and shape them. When it comes to New Testament letters, the genre is being stretched by the Catholic letters. We give the label letter to at least 21 of the texts of the New Testament, and sometimes 22, when Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse, is included as a letter. In broad categories, the letters of the New Testament are divided between the Pauline letters and the Catholic letters. The Pauline letters tend to follow the standard letter format from antiquity pretty closely. Most contain 3 or 4 of the elements that make a letter a letter. There are some exceptions. Galatians, for example, doesn't have a thanksgiving or a final greeting, and the same is true of 1 Timothy and Titus. But these are exceptions, and there are some good reasons that have been proposed for the absence of these elements in those particular letters. When it comes to the Catholic letters, it's exceptional when one contains more than 2 of the normal letter elements. Only in the case of 1 Peter, 2 John, and 3 John are there 3 of the 4, and none of the Catholic letters contain all 4 of the letter elements that were standard in antiquity. Most only contain 2, and John does not contain any. It really has no features of letters except for the body, which is really just a different kind of text altogether. 1 John is a treatise, not even embedded in letter form. There's really nothing about a letter to 1 John. 3 of the 4 other Catholic letters are also better categorized as something other than a letter. Hebrews is a sermon or word of exhortation. That's what it labels itself. James is better categorized as wisdom literature, and 1 Peter is best categorized as part of the Ancient Testament genre. So, 4 letters can be categorized as letters, but 4 of the Catholic letters are best categorized as something else entirely. Number 4. The Catholic letters are universal documents. The word Catholic means universal or general. What makes the Catholic letters Catholic is that they are, generally speaking, not written to specific individuals or communities addressing a specific situation. This is what we find with the Pauline letters. Philemon is written to suggest that Philemon do something with the enslaved Onesimus. Galatians is written because Gentiles in Galatia are considering circumcision, and Paul wants to tell them in the strongest possible terms that that is a bad idea. Romans is written to congregations in Rome that Paul did not found to lay out his gospel message, perhaps for the purpose of reconciling different groups there, or perhaps so that they'll support Paul in his westward mission to Spain. And the conceit of the pastoral letters is that they're written to Paul's mentees to give them guidance on how to run a church, and for them to provide guidance for how people are to live and how they are to act in the church. The Catholic letters don't really address one single situation, and it's hard to determine whether or not each one has a constellation of purposes, or even a single purpose. Instead, the Catholic letters offer exhortations and reflections that are applicable and relevant in a variety of different contexts. And not only are the Catholic letters general and universal in their contents, but they're also general with respect to whom is addressed. Not all the Catholic letters have the salutations that are part and parcel of ancient letters, but the ones that do address a general rather than a specific audience. They are neither addressed to individual people, with the exception of 3rd John, which is written to someone called Gaius, nor are they written to particular locations. James and Peter address the tribes and exiles in the dispersion. The dispersion is the diaspora, those spread throughout the world. 2nd Peter addresses those who have received the Christian faith, and Jude addresses anyone who is called. 2nd John addresses the elect lady, which is a reference not to a specific actual lady, but is meant to refer to the church at large. What we have with the Catholic letters is a group of documents written to a completely general audience. This implies that Christians recognize their geographical spread, which is a major theme also in the book of Acts, and they wrote to connect themselves to one another. And this is actually somewhat unique in the ancient world. Based on the text left behind, Christians appear to have been a relatively literary and educated bunch. Following the Judaism from which it would eventually break, Christianity was a religion of the book, or perhaps we could say a religion of the books, since there were multiple different kinds of documents that were important to them. The fact that the New Testament is more like a library or collection than a book is reflected not only in its overarching contents, but also in the differing contents of the Catholic letters, which are meant to be universal and general in their appeal. Number 3. Many of the Catholic letters are attributed to people who were close to Jesus. In the Gospels, Peter, James, and John are the 3 disciples who are in Jesus' inner circle. They're present at key moments in Jesus' ministry, such as the Transfiguration, where they witness Jesus in his glorified state alongside Moses and Elijah. They're also with Jesus during significant events like the raising of Jairus' daughter and in the Garden of Gethsemane during his agonizing prayer before his arrest. This privileged position within the group of the 12 disciples indicates a close relationship with Jesus. These 3 may have been Jesus' closest disciples historically, or it may be that the gospel authors are writing early Christian leadership back into the gospels themselves. That is, perhaps Peter, James, and John are depicted as closest to Jesus precisely because they became leaders of the movement after his death and ascension. Or perhaps they became leaders because they were closest to Jesus. Whatever the case, these 3 disciples appear to have been particularly important in the early church. This is indicated by Acts, by early church fathers, and also by the fact that several Catholic letters are attributed to them. The titles James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, of course, imply that these 3 are the authors of these texts. And James and Peter are, in fact, named as the author in the salutations of those documents. In the case of 2nd and 3rd John, the named author is the elder. The letters are, technically speaking, anonymous. No author is directly named. With 1st John, there's no salutation, and so not even the elder is identified as the author. Tradition, and early tradition at that, has it that John the Apostle is the author of these 3 texts, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Just as early tradition has it that John the Apostle is the author of the Gospel of John, and there are very striking similarities in language and style between the Gospel of John and these letters, especially 1st John. 1st John also seems to imply that that its author is an eyewitness of Jesus from its very first verse. It says, "We declare to you what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, and what we have looked at and touched with our hands, concerning the word of life." That the author of 2nd and 3rd John is identified as the elder presumes a position of authority, something that the Apostle John certainly will have possessed. All this to say, while 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John do not name John as their author in the text themselves, the later titles do, and tradition associates the letters with these apostles. But it's not just James, Peter, and John who are figures close to Jesus and claimed as authors of Catholic letters. Jude is also someone close to Jesus, his brother, just like James. While Jude itself does not directly claim fraternity with Jesus in Jude 1, the implication is pretty strong. Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. Judas, or Jude, is mentioned in the synoptic passages of Mark 6:3 and Matthew 13:55 as one of Jesus' brother, along with James, Joseph, and Simon. Thus, when Jude introduces himself as the brother of James, we're meant also to make the connection to Jesus. Jude is Jesus' brother, just as James is Jesus' brother, but neither the author of James nor the author of Jude make the direct connection to Jesus. In fact, both indicate that their relationship to Jesus is one of slave and master, enslaved and enslaver. For whatever reason, they decide not to play up their brotherly credentials. It should probably not be too surprising that it's debated whether or not James, Peter, John, and Jude actually wrote these texts. These very well could be pseudonyms used precisely because these persons had a close relationship to Jesus. Remember, once again, that authorship is a complicated affair, both in the ancient world and the modern world, and writing in someone else's name in the ancient world was well known and practiced for a variety of different reasons. The reasons that some scholars doubt that these particular figures actually wrote these letters vary from letter to letter, but one of the main reasons for doubt for all of them is whether or not persons of the Galilean working class, fishers and carpenters, would have the capacity to create such Greek texts. This is especially the case with 1 Peter, which shows some of the most sophisticated Greek in the New Testament. Whether as a literary device or as an actuality, most of the Catholic letters are associated with a figure in Jesus' inner circle. And whether as a literary device or as an actuality, this indicates that the Apostle Paul does not have a monopoly on New Testament letters. Number 2. Jesus appears and functions differently in each respective Catholic letter. Given that each author of the different Catholic letters is depicted as someone close to Jesus, and that each person has a different experience of Jesus, we should expect Jesus to be presented and function differently in different texts. There are, after all, multiple different Jesuses. Jesus is constantly being reinterpreted and represented in different ways and in different texts. For the most part, that should be something that's celebrated. In Hebrews, Jesus is a cosmic high priest, serving in the cosmic temple, and is greater than the angels, Moses, and any other priest ever. Hebrews, with its incredibly high Christology, has Jesus as the mediator of a new covenant. Jesus is mentioned directly only twice in James 1:1 and James 2:1, but his influence stands behind this text, especially with respect to ethics and action. James emphasized a living faith that seems to be heavily influenced by Jesus' teaching, especially in the Sermon on the Mount. In 1 Peter, Jesus is the example of a suffering servant. Those who experience suffering for their faith, whether real or perceived suffering, are meant to look to Jesus as a paragon of one who suffered unjustly. 2 Peter also emphasized looking to Jesus. The audience is to look to Jesus' power for virtuous living, to avoid false teaching, and also to look for and eagerly await his second coming. In 1 John, Jesus is depicted as the incarnate Word of life who enables fellowship with God and other people. Jesus' atoning sacrifice is highlighted as the means of cleansing from sin, and his commandments, especially the commandment to love, are emphasized as essential for true Christian living. 2 and 3 John likewise commend following Jesus by walking in truth and love, though in these short letters, the line between following Jesus in these respects is not so straight. 3 John doesn't even mention Jesus by name. Finally, in Jude, Jesus is depicted as an authority who will judge false teachers and apostates who promote doctrinal wrongs, emphasizing Jesus' role in executing judgment upon the ungodly. And number 1, the Catholic letters have a variety of different themes and emphases. Jesus is central to every New Testament text in one way or another, even the one that does not mention him by name, 3 John. The portrayal or function of Jesus in each of the Catholic letters is closely related to its overarching themes and emphasis. There are some similarities in themes that go through all of the Catholic letters, such as the importance of ethical action and living that's aligned with faith, perseverance in the midst of suffering, avoidance of false teaching and false teachers, and love and unified community and fellowship. But each of these documents also has its own unique themes and emphases. We could very well have a top 5 video on what's going on in each one of these letters individually. Hebrews' overarching emphasis is on the superiority of Jesus. James is about wise, just, and ethical living. 1 Peter is largely about holy living in the middle of suffering. 2nd Peter emphasizes the day of the Lord and persevering until it. Truth, love, and community are common threads through all 3 Johannine letters, and Jude is concerned with contending for a common faith, especially in the face of apostate intruders.